Hi everyone, this is German Archive, and I hope you're all doing well. One type of comment I commonly read under my late war German newsweek videos, and also on other channels that upload similar content, are comments that make fun of German late war propaganda. I often read comments like, "The victories are coming closer and closer to home," comments that make fun of the obvious difference between German propaganda reporting and the actual military situation in 1944 and 1945. One type of comment that I find particularly interesting is the comparison of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, and Baghdad Bob. Now, if you don't know who Baghdad Bob is, let me give you a brief backstory. Baghdad Bob, also known as Comical Ali, is a nickname given to Mohammed Said al-Sahaf, who was the Iraqi Minister of Information under Saddam Hussein, acting as a spokesman for his government. He became somewhat famous, or rather infamous, during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when he held bizarre press conferences claiming that American soldiers were so afraid of Iraqi troops they committed mass suicides outside of Baghdad, reports about alleged successful Iraqi counterattacks, and alleged destruction of hundreds of American tanks, or just wild rambling comparing American officials to gangsters like Al Capone.
This is a typical American official. Al Capone he is the typical official American.
He even denied the presence of American troops inside Iraqi's capital when the sound of combat could already be heard in the background of his press conference, and he repeatedly claimed that Iraq would destroy and kill all American units.
We will slaughter them all. Those invaders, their tombs will be here in Iraq.
But I personally believe that these comments and comparisons are a little bit unfair. I understand they are jokes and some of them are genuinely funny, but, and I mean no offense to Mr. al-Sahaf, Goebbels was a bit smarter than the Iraqi government, which is a sentence I never thought I would say. There was a strategy and a goal in German late war propaganda, and this is what I wanted to briefly talk about in today's video. The logic, goals, and aims in German late war propaganda. Now, to begin with, the military situation in late 1944 was not good, to put it mildly. While already suffering severe setbacks in 1943, if we take a look at the front lines on June 1st, 1944, we can see that Germany and the Axis still occupied large parts of Europe. However, mere 4 months later, on October 1st, the situation looks like this. Yikes. Germany lost France and Belgium. The Soviets recaptured almost all of the territory Germany had occupied since 1941 and stood at Germany's border in East Prussia. Bulgaria and Romania dropped out of the war, and Germany was about to retreat from Greece. Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union in September, leaving only Hungary and the puppet states of Slovakia and the Italian Social Republic as remaining allies of Germany. On the Eastern Front alone, according to German Army High Command documents, the Germans lost 904,081 men in the 4 months between June and September 1944, largely due to the Soviet Operation Bagration. Ever-increasing Allied air attacks on German industries, cities, and infrastructure hampered German armament industry and brought civilian morale to a low point. Additionally, the lack of raw materials and resources became a source of concern, slowing down German troop movements and reducing industrial output. More and more weaponry, especially tanks, had to be abandoned in the field due to a lack of fuel. But this video is not about the military situation, but rather what the propaganda made of it. To begin with, people generally knew that the war was going bad. All the things I've mentioned before were widely known among the German people. While of course the German propaganda wasn't officially admitting much of this stuff, simply by looking at official reports, seeing that the fighting, which was happening in places like Stalingrad and Leningrad a few years ago, was now happening on the East Prussian border and in Hungary, was more than enough to tell people that the war might not be going so well. And in fact, in many cases the Wehrmacht report was censored in a way to not mention certain place names to avoid that people realizing how close the front lines were already to the German border. Drafting more and more men to the Wehrmacht, increasing working hours, more and more places like restaurants or theaters shutting down, scarcity of food rations, increasing Allied air attacks, letters from the front and stories from soldiers on leave were more than enough to give a pretty good picture of how grim the situation really was. Additionally, listening to foreign broadcasts, especially BBC's German service, was rather common among civilians despite the strict punishments, and people either listened to it on their own or heard it from their neighbors and friends. And the propaganda ministry knew about that. One of the things the German propaganda ministry during the war spent a lot of time and effort on was to get a clear picture of how people thought. Of course, in a dictatorship it is hard to get people to voice their true opinions, but reports made by the SD and the intelligence agency of the SS often openly reported about these feelings and opinions. And Goebbels knew about that as well. He had a fairly good picture of how the German people viewed the war, especially when it was going bad, and his diary gives good examples of that. The idea that Goebbels was a fanatical believer in Nazism is true, but he was also surprisingly sober and realistic when asserting the war situation and the chances of a German victory. Now, with that in mind, what was the main goal of German late war propaganda? The overall goal was no longer to win the war, or to create the illusion that Germany was winning the war in the way they were winning the wars of 1939 and 1940. As I've just laid out, it was very obvious to everyone that Germany was losing the war, especially after the terrible defeats in Normandy in the Soviet summer offensive. It was also very obvious to everyone that Germany was no longer able to defend its skies, as more and more cities fell victim to Allied bombing raids. So the main goal and the main impression that the German propaganda of 1944 tried to create was that of a successful defensive warfare. Now, when I say successful, the idea was not to claim that the Wehrmacht was able to hold a certain line, but rather that the German troops were inflicting so much casualties on their enemies that they would have to stop their advances sooner or later. This line of thinking, by the way, was not completely illusional. The British Army, for example, suffered enough casualties in the 1944 campaigns that the British government had to draft additional manpower. Training for new recruits was shortened in the British Army in late 1944, and men previously deferred for industrial work, as well as men who were previously outside the age gap for the draft, were now also drafted, as well as personnel transfer from the Royal Navy and Air Force, bringing an additional roughly 50,000 men for the British Army in December 1944 alone. A similar thing happened in the Soviet Army. By 1944, the Soviets had lost an estimated 8 million soldiers killed or seriously wounded. While the Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, was a huge success, the Soviet losses were also high. The Soviet lost around 200,000 men killed and up to 500,000 wounded. Additionally, almost 3,000 tanks and assault guns were lost. So while the Wehrmacht did suffer terrible losses in the summer of 1944, their enemies also lost a huge number of soldiers and material. And this was a key point in German late war propaganda. The idea was, if we inflict enough casualties, the enemies will have to abandon their advances at some point. And then they would have to sue for peace. Which brings us to another topic, a peace deal. While we nowadays know that World War II ended with the total defeat of Germany, such an outcome is actually incredibly rare for wars. History has shown that usually at some point the military and political leadership of a country that is losing a war come to the conclusion that the war is no longer winnable and try to negotiate some sort of peace agreement. This is how World War I ended after all, which was still fresh in the mind of most people. The Versailles Treaty was harsh, but it kept Germany intact and brought peace. That very line of thinking was also present in much of the German leadership. It was a topic that often came up in discussions among the Nazi elite, because even they knew that the war was no longer winnable by military means alone. Hitler and others believed that from a position of strength, e.g. after an impressive military victory, they could negotiate with either the Soviet Union or the Western powers. There were two groups in the Nazi and Wehrmacht leadership. The first, the bigger one, thought that a peace deal could be arranged with the Western allies, potentially even some sort of alliance to fight together against the Soviet Union. There were already political cracks, the beginning of the Cold War, that showed in late 1944 and early 1945, and this was known to the Nazis. Of course, in their desperation, they massively overestimated the impact of these cracks, and there was absolutely no reason to suggest or believe that the alliance between the USSR and the Western Allies would actually break before the complete surrender of Nazi Germany. But people like Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, or Walter Schellenberg, head of the Foreign Intelligence Agency of the SS, believed that it was feasible to conclude a separate peace deal with the Western Allies. Others, including the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, or Wehrmacht generals such as Kurt Zeitzler, considered making a separate peace deal with the Soviet Union, which was also something Goebbels was a friend of, as Goebbels has been voicing pro-Russian ideas since his youth. They believed that Stalin would be open to a separate peace deal in exchange for territory, but of course, the prospect of a total victory over Nazi Germany and the countless massacres and devastation caused by the Germans in the Soviet Union made this extremely unlikely. At any rate, the idea of a positive peace deal for Germany, so to speak, was something that many, both soldiers and civilians, believed in, and history shows that this was the normal way to end the war, not to fight until the bitter end. Historical evidence, of course, does not back up the idea that a peace deal was a realistic option for Germany in late 1944, but it is understandable that in their desperation, the Nazi leadership clung to every straw. This was a key aspect of German late war propaganda, the idea here being something like, keep holding on until the political leadership achieved a positive peace deal for us. The next major topic was fear. No, not that one. Yeah, that one. Most Germans knew or had a vague idea about the countless war crimes, massacres, looting, and raping that were committed by German soldiers in the East. Be it the stories from soldiers on vacation, letters, rumors, or through foreign propaganda, or even anti-Nazi resistance fighters. Knowledge about massacres and war crimes in general committed by German troops in the East was pretty widespread. Not any concrete knowledge necessary, but just a general, our soldiers are doing some pretty bad things in the East feeling. Most people didn't have a clear image, and officially was of course never mentioned. But again, most people have at least heard the rumors, not only about war crimes, but also about the Holocaust. And while it is easy to ignore these rumors or don't care much about the stories in 1942 or 43, when the war came home to Germany in late 1944, people began to panic. They correctly assumed that the Soviet soldiers would take revenge for everything that German soldiers had done in the Soviet Union. And when the first stories of Soviet war crimes were published, this fear filled everyone who lived in the eastern parts of Germany. And this was another major topic in late war propaganda. The idea of fighting to protect one's family, village, wife, and children against the Soviet hordes, the Mongol invasion from Asia, as the Soviet advances were often called in German propaganda. Actual or alleged Soviet war crimes were prominently featured in German radio, newspaper, and newsreels, such as the infamous massacre of Nemmersdorf, where Soviet soldiers killed 14 civilians in East Prussia on October 21st. These reports were often massively overstated by German propaganda. The number of killed German civilians was often reported higher than it actually was, and grotesque stories about castrated men, women that were split in half by 2 Soviet tanks, and others were published, often lacking any factual basis. However, ironically, many Germans were not particularly shocked by these stories, and saw the actions of the Red Army as a natural consequences to the behavior of the German soldiers in the Soviet Union. It seemed that the common German civilian could understand the Soviet soldiers' thirst for revenge. But of course, many people were scared. The fighting in the East was often way fiercer than in the West, and while soldiers and civilians had no problem surrendering to the Americans, they often fought until the bitter end in the East. This fear of reprisals, fear of Soviet revenge, was another major topic in German war propaganda, which is pretty self-explanatory, I believe. Of course, German propaganda also tried to build up that fear against the Americans and British, but in many instances, soldiers and civilians in the West were far more relaxed and had no problem surrendering to the Americans. It seemed that in early 1945 in the West, many soldiers and civilians were even eager to surrender to the Americans, so they could finally put an end to the fighting. This lack of fighting will, the lack of fanatism in fighting against the Americans and the British, is something Goebbels regularly complained about in his diary, and German propaganda tried very hard to translate the fanatism of the fight against the Soviets to the Western Front, but they largely failed. So that's basically the two major topics, the two major ideas of German late war propaganda. Encourage fighting to cause the enemy enough losses so they would have to stop their advance, resulting in a peace deal with a good outcome for Germany, and fighting to prevent one's own family and village from falling victim to massacres. But did it work? To an extent, I would actually say yes. Over the years, I've read hundreds of diary entries of German soldiers and civilians, especially from later in the war, so from 1944 and 45. And while many generally describe the bad state of things, the bombing campaigns, the continued enemy advances, the constant withdrawals, there was still a sense of confidence in the leadership and especially in the Führer, that he would, in one way or another, turn the situation around. People often repeated the propaganda claim that if the Wehrmacht would just cause enough losses to the enemy, if the Wehrmacht could bring the enemies to a halt, they would have to sue for peace. And especially as the enemy reached German soil, the fighting shifted from conquering Europe to defending one's own soil, defending German towns and cities. As one German colonel, who took part in the Battle of Aachen in October 1944, puts it in his diary, suddenly we were no longer the Nazis, we were German soldiers. Fighting on German soil, with a population that was actually friendly towards its soldiers and placing their hope and trust into them certainly helped raise morale, especially on the Eastern Front. So these two propaganda topics did resonate with some people. And there was even a sense of hope in late 1944 that it could be possible to defend the Fortress Germany, to hold the Rhine and the Vistula and achieve a positive peace deal. Of course, most of these hopes quickly disappeared in early 1945 when the Soviets broke through the Vistula defense, and the Western Allies broke through the German defenses in February and March 1945, and people could really see that all hope was lost. But for a few months in late 1944 and early 45, despite knowing how bad the situation really was, there was still a sense of hope and fighting morale among some of the German soldiers and civilians. Of course, not everyone believed that, and many people were completely disillusioned and did not believe into any favorable outcome of the war. But the number of people who had some kind of hope was still surprisingly high, and I think the propaganda played at least some part in this. I would say that Goebbels and the German propaganda did their best they could in their situation. Goebbels had of course no influence over how the war situation developed. That was the responsibility of the military and political leadership. And ironically, Goebbels had been sidelined from actual power since the war began. But he had influence over how propaganda reported the situation, and he did reasonably well. Of course, it was still propaganda, and a lot of reported numbers of destroyed enemy tanks and planes were inflated and too high. But the general direction of propaganda that Goebbels took in late 1944 was probably the best he could, and one has to admit that Goebbels was pretty smart in his terrible propaganda work for the Nazi regime. Thank you all for watching. I rarely do these narrative videos, mainly because they obviously take much longer to make than a mere transcription and translation of newsreel. I have to come up with an idea, write a script, and do some actual research and fact-checking. Although in this case, it was rather easy for me. I'm generally more interested in the late war period, and I have been researching late war German propaganda for a long time, so I basically had done all the research for this topic before I even wrote the script. But additionally, there's of course the recording and the video editing, which all take some time. I'm not the best at these kind of videos, and I can't make cool animations or anything like that, but I still hope at least some of you found this interesting. As usual, I will put the sources I used in the video description, and if you have any question or remark, put them in the comments below. I do read every single comment. That's it for today. I wish you all a great weekend.